we're back with the next episode of My Hero Academia, where Team Edgesaw is continuing on with their siege at the villa with the Paranormal Liberation Front. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in this episode, but there was something that was mainly focused on this episode, and that was Hawks and Twice, and eventually Dabi when he ends up joining along with the picture, which I didn't think the episode was going to do. Just basically off the previews, it didn't really seem like the episode was going to focus too much on Twice and Hawks in the episode, but it does. But before we get into that, just wanted to point out a couple of other things that happened beforehand. Because it mostly focuses on the stuff at the villa, we actually see like stuff happening with the characters specifically over there and not at the hospital with all the Nomus and stuff. And yeah, so something really cool that happens is that we get to see some of the other heroes do some really cool like team up attacks and stuff, and that was really cool. Tokoyami ends up showing up in the episode, and he ends up showing off that he's able to use a new move that I don't think we've seen him use before. I know I haven't. He calls it Ragnarok, which is really cool, and it's basically just a more beefed up, powerful version of Dark Shadow, because Dark Shadow gets more powerful whenever he's in darker areas, and that's exactly what ended up happening within the episode. He ends up running into Redestro, and something I guess I never realized before about Redestro. I guess I just wasn't paying attention, because the previous season when he shows up, I just was starting to lose interest towards the end, because it sort of felt like that they were losing a lot of potential. It felt like they weren't living up to the potential that the arc was supposed to have with Redestro in the arc when he was introduced, and I guess I just sort of missed what his quirk actually does. But I sort of like how in the episode, when Redestro is informed that the heroes are invading the villa, because this quirk is based off of how stressful he gets more powerful. Immediately his entire body and face is completely covered in black, meaning he's pretty much like at full power at this point. So Tokoyami's Dark Shadow ends up hitting Redestro at full power, and Redestro's able to at least sort of hold it back, which surprised him. And that's when Dark Shadow sees Giganto Machia. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know, it's been a while. It was cool to see that they know that he's there, because he's a super big threat, and if he's out on the loose, he's going to be able to cause a lot of damage, but obviously he's not going to be able to do anything until Shigaraki shows up and he actually gives out in order to go do something. But obviously, because they're sort of hinting at the fact that that's potentially not going to be the case, something is going to happen, and he's going to cause a lot of damage to a lot of other characters, and something's going to happen in regards to that. But the episode mostly just ends up focusing on Hawks and Twice, and I didn't know what to expect when I saw it in the previews, but I was actually genuinely surprised with what they ended up doing within the episode. And I already knew that Twice was one of the more deeper, complex characters within the series, especially from the villains, and I actually really enjoy him as a villain because of his depth and his uniqueness. Because the whole thing about Twice is that he lost his parents at a young age, had to basically fend off for himself. Something happened later on in his life when he got older, to where he was falsely accused of something that he didn't commit, and he ended up getting a criminal record. Lost his job, lost his home, and his quirk, where he's able to just basically create an exact copy of himself and other people. He ends up doing that to create exact copies of himself, because he's lonely. He's one of the most lonely characters in this entire show. And it eventually gets to one point where, because he's able to create such perfect replicas of himself, the replicas then start claiming that they are actually the original. Something happens, all the clones end up killing each other, but then he pretty much has this disorder where he can't disassociate with himself with whether or not he's actually the original or he's actually a clone. And in the last season, we see that he's able to realize that he is the true self, his true self, the true version of himself. And that's what allows him to be able to use his quirk at full power and to its full potential. And so the whole point of Hawks being with Twice is that he was the one that was specifically the one to get rid of Twice, so that way he doesn't cause mass mayhem. Because if Twice is out on the loose, helping the villains fight the heroes, then he can cause a whole lot of damage, because then he can just create exact copies of all the other villains who are in the immediate area, along with himself. So it was very important that Hawks had to take out Twice, but they further Twice's character in this episode because he blamed himself. He blamed himself most of the time for a lot of the stuff that he did. When it was like when he introduced Overhaul to the League of Villains. Overhaul ended up injuring one of the other guys, Compress, I think it was, and then ended up killing one of the other members. And he blamed himself for that, and he didn't want that to ever happen again because of the fact that he was so lonely for so long in his life. He puts all of his other friends' happiness in front of himself, before his own. So the whole thing about his character is that he's just trying to do the best he can for the people around him, even though the people around him are, mentally ill people who are doing very heinous actions. And that's really the tragedy of Twice as a character, is that he's doing all this incredibly evil things, and he's hanging around with these evil people who have murdered and stolen things, and mostly the murder thing, and are trying to attack the heroes and pretty much take over the entire world just for the sake of it. And the whole thing that Hawks points out about Twice is that Twice is surprisingly good-natured in comparison to all the other heroes. So he spends the majority of the fight trying to not kill him. Hawks spends the entire time, putting his emotions first with how he feels about Hawks, or how he feels about Twice. And he's trying not to kill him. Dabi ends up showing up, and Dabi was like, "Oh, I didn't even trust you for the beginning," and this and that and yada yada, which perfectly fits into his character. And Dabi was actually really cool in this episode. He looked pretty intimidating, actually. And again, furthering with the tragedy of Hawks, this lonely person who created versions of himself to have friends around him and comfort him. He ended up losing his mind, only to later have the strength of his friends help him, confirm that he is his real self, and only to, at the end, not be able to protect the people that he cares about. He's very good-natured, deep down, but ultimately he's a villain, and tragically Twice ends up having to get killed at the very end of the episode. His clone ends up disappearing completely after communicating with Himiko, and Twice is dead. And I double-checked and confirmed with some sources. Yeah, he's never coming back. Twice is dead, which is very good for the heroes, obviously, but, it's good for the heroes, obviously, but it's tragic because he could have potentially, turned his life around. He potentially could have been, he could have done a whole lot to make sure that he was on a better path, and he could have potentially, changed his whole trajectory and maybe be a hero, or maybe just be a better person, and he wouldn't have to, be stuck living in the situation that he's in. But instead, he's, forced to be taken down. Hawks had to do it, and it sucks. It sucks because Twice really is one of the better characters, especially on the villain side, where I don't really care for a lot of the villains, and I sort of feel like that's what the last season which was supposed to try to do, but I just ultimately just didn't really care about any of them. Even Shigaraki, who had the most backstory shown towards him, and the more I see it and remember about it, because towards the tail end of the last season, I just ultimately just turned my brain off and didn't really care. I don't even really remember much of what happened. But the more that I look back on it and I remember the things that did happen, I'm like, yeah, Shigaraki was a very tragic character, and he has a tragic backstory with what ended up happening. The whole thing with him being abused by his family and his father especially. Because the whole thing about his dad was that his mother was the wielder for One for All, and she ended up dying, and he ended up hating heroes. And even though he wanted to be a hero himself and was willing to do whatever he could, his father didn't want that and was physically abusive, and that ultimately led him down a path where he ended up killing his entire family and lost his mind and went insane. He's a tragic character, but I didn't really feel anything when I saw that in the last season. Twice was a character that I actually felt stuff for, because he seemed like a very realistic character. Not to say that the same thing can't be applied to Shigaraki, but Shigaraki is kind of like more on like, I don't really know how to explain it. It just, for some reason, Twice felt more realistic, aspects of like schizophrenia where he like creates like mental images of other people around him to be able to, communicate with, even though they don't really exist. I could see that actually happening in real life. I can see someone actually doing something like that in real life. Twice was such a realistic character in my mind, and the fact that he couldn't get better, right? He couldn't have joined along with Hawks and decided to be a better person. He instead had to stay loyal to the people around him who were terrible, awful people. It sucks. Twice is a very tragic character, but there's nothing you can really do about it. The episode ends after that point, and now we just have to wait until next week where we continue on with the story of what's going on, and we go back to the hospital where the heroes are fighting the high-end Nomus, and it seems like Aizawa is going to be taking the helm because he's going to have to do a lot of erasing of these Nomus quirks, so we're going to have to wait and see what ends up happening there. Ultimately, the episode was actually really impressive. Like I said, I didn't really know if it was going to focus so much on Hawks and Twice and their conflict, but it did. But I really liked it. It was cool. And I don't know what else the episode, or I don't know what else the arc is going to do after this point. I don't know what else they're going to do. I don't know what the specific characters are going to be doing, but hopefully it ends up being enjoyable. So, yeah. That's pretty much it. If you liked the video, be sure to like. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys next one. Hope you guys have a fantastic day. I'm out. Peace.